Everyone. Thank you very much, and I'll declare the meeting open. Today we have the initial proposal, the consideration of the post-hearings panel consideration of the representation review. I don't believe there are any apologies today, so we'll move on to the next item on the agenda. And these are the formal deliberations, so we're not going to move on to them. So everyone has been circulated a copy of this, and a version of it is up on the board there. And so what we're going to do is that, as you can see here, the headline says main issues written, submission members which raise this issue, additional issues, staff comment, hearing panel decision, and the hearing panel reasoning. Now, the reason that we're doing this is because we're following a specific process that is laid out for us in the Local Electoral Act. Is that right? Local Electoral Act. And the council's final proposal must be based on submissions, or else the initial proposal needs to be retained. So that doesn't mean in its entirety. It means as we go through each element, if we are going to make changes from the initial proposal, it needs to be based on submissions. Otherwise, the community has not had an opportunity to give feedback on the proposal, and community members have grounds to submit appeals and/or objections. Council's public notice of its final proposal under section 19N2 is required to state the reasons for amendments and the reasons for any rejection of submissions, which is why this is formatted in this particular way. Therefore, the reasons must be recorded in the local authority's resolution of its final proposal. Council must consider the following issues in particular, and to record detailed reasoning for all related decisions. So these will be the formal decisions that we make at the end. Identification of communities of interest, the basis of election, establishment or retention of community boards, specifying the ratio of population to proposed members for each proposed ward, constituency or subdivision, and the reasons for those proposals in terms of section 19B2 and, if applicable, section 19B3, and consideration by territorial authorities of ward boundaries coinciding with community boundaries. Any person who's made a submission on the council's initial proposal may lodge an appeal against the council's decision. An appeal must relate to the matters raised in that person's submission. So the range of people that can appeal is established by those who made submissions. This document goes through each one of those and identifies those that supported or did not support or proposed different components of the consideration that we'll be going through today. And I thought it might be just quite useful again to remind people exactly the considerations that we have, the purpose of local government, just to remind us why we're all here, to enable democratic local decision making and action by and on behalf of communities, and to promote the social, economic, environmental and cultural well-being of communities in the present and for the future. Section, I'm just moving on to the, sorry, I printed this off the Local Government Commission website. The key factors in considering in reviewing our representation arrangements, we are required to provide for effective representation of communities of interest and fair representation of electors. So those are three separate factors that need to be considered carefully: communities of interest, effective representation of communities of interest, and fair representation of electors. They are all interrelated with each other. So what I'm intending to do is, as we work through this table that has been prepared for us, and again, thank you to the staff who've put this table together, because it does make our task much easier. You'll see that on each section there is a green headline, and the green headline, the first one is Banks Peninsula Ward integrated into City Ward or not. That is the overarching issue, but there are several decisions that we need to make, either to reject submissions or to amend the initial proposal, or whether to agree. So as we go through each of the individual ones, what I'm proposing is that we have an overarching debate. So I'm going to get a mover and a seconder for each of the recommendations that sit under the decision one. So it's the penultimate column. And then I'm going to, once I've got a mover and a seconder for each of them, I'm going to open up the issue for debate. And so we will debate the particular issue, the green issue, as it were, and then I will put the individual submissions once the debate is concluded. Is that clear to everyone? Very good. Okay, so could I have a mover and a seconder for point 1, that we reject the submissions which supported the initial proposal to integrate Banks Peninsula into the Banks Peninsula Sumner Ward? It's moved by Andrew, seconded by Phil Clearwater. The second motion is to amend the initial proposal to change Banks Peninsula to current ward boundaries. Would someone like to move that? It's moved by Paul Lonsdale, seconded by Andrew Turner. And I think that's it for those two ones. So now I will open up the overarching issue, whether Banks Peninsula Ward should be integrated into a city ward or not. I'll open that up for debate. Andrew. Thank you.
We heard from a number of submitters from Banks Peninsula, and in particular from the Akaroa-Wairewa parts of the existing Banks Peninsula ward, around issues of isolation. We saw photographs and we heard of all sorts of examples as to why the isolation experienced by particularly those on the other side of the hilltop is very real. We heard about weather events, we heard about driving distances, any number of issues that certainly speak to that community as an isolated community, and that actually reflects the decision that was made previously by Council as we put our initial proposal together. We also heard from submitters closer to the city, so submitters around Littleton Harbour, and in particular submitters on the city side of the Port Hills, so from Heathcote, from Mount Pleasant, and from the Hagley Ferrymead Community Board, among others, that suggested that those communities didn't have commonality, didn't have a community of interest with Banks Peninsula, and in fact that those communities saw themselves as looking to each other, looking to Ferrymead, and looking down Ferry Road essentially and into Woolston and the city. The argument in many ways against the isolated community of Banks Peninsula is that Littleton is separated only by the tunnel from Christchurch. And that's the truth, and whilst there are arguments that can be put that during weather events and in the earthquake and so on, Littleton was in fact isolated from Christchurch, the reality is that Littleton is a lot closer to Christchurch as a community of interest than other parts of the peninsula, like those in the Akaroa subdivision of the existing ward. The reality, though, remains that the peninsula is one community of interest. Akaroa and Wairewa certainly do have a community of interest and are isolated. As soon as you start to look at separating Littleton off from the rest of the peninsula, that's where the argument starts to fall down, because of course all of the communities around Akaroa Harbour and the outer bays and the southern bays are a community of interest. All of the communities around Littleton Harbour are also a community of interest. The idea of splitting Littleton from Diamond Harbour, which are connected by the ferry, the Inner Harbour Road that goes right around there. There are any number of organisations that go right the way around Littleton Harbour and in fact go right the way across the peninsula. And we heard in submissions from the Rod Donald Trust and other organisations that are pan-peninsular organisations. So if we accept that Akaroa is a isolated community, and we accept that the peninsula is a community of interest, and then we start to take the view that Littleton Harbour is also a strong community of interest, and that Littleton Harbour and Akaroa Harbour have such similarities, and the peninsula in fact is one entity as both a landform and a community of interest, that certainly speaks to the arguments that have been put very strongly that Banks Peninsula is in fact one isolated community of interest. We always expected people from the peninsula to say that, but I think the resounding argument really comes from the fact that people that were proposed to be communities that were proposed to be merged with the peninsula were also saying the same thing, that the communities of Mount Pleasant and Heathcote and so on essentially look into the city rather than out onto the peninsula. So I think the arguments have been very well put to support the peninsula keeping its existing boundaries and been seen as an isolated community and one community of interest.
Yanni?
I just wanted to speak in regards to this issue, and I think overwhelmingly what we heard from the peninsula is they like having their local representation, and who can blame them? Why wouldn't you want to keep what you had, and why wouldn't you want to have a local councillor for your local area? And in fact, I thought it was really interesting when we heard from a number of them submitters that actually, in my view, they actually would have supported smaller wards in the urban area to counterbalance the population ratio that they had being retained. So, I think it's important to look at this in the context of the number of councillors and the size of the urban wards compared to the peninsula ward. I'm happy to support this today going to the Local Government Commission. I think we've been told that this will be treated automatically as an appeal, and therefore there'll be rights for others to come in and make submissions around that change in the population. I guess the more substantial issue will be, in my view, around the population ratios for the urban wards. And I didn't hear from the peninsula that they supported bigger wards from our initial proposal in order to keep their peninsula ward being the status quo. In fact, I heard the opposite. So we can have that debate as we move through this process, but I just wanted to place on record that my understanding from the peninsula was they supported retaining the local Banks Peninsula ward, but it wasn't at the expense of increasing larger urban wards to higher population ratios than our initial proposal.
I should interrupt just one thing, because you said that it's treated as an appeal. It's referred to the Local Government Commission, so it's not an appeal per se. There may be people who appeal against the decision, but it is referred, and they will consider it because it is outside the 10%.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Phil.
Look, I certainly support the recommendations. I think. And Andrew traversed the arguments for Banks Peninsula remaining a separate ward. But I think when I was aware, and other councillors too were aware, of the amendment to the 2013 Local Electoral Act, that in fact, that now the Act doesn't require fair representation the same way, when it would prevent effective representation of isolated communities, and I think that also refers really to distinct communities of interest. So I think that's quite a change in the thinking of the Commission, and with that in mind, I believe it should be a change in the thinking of this Council.
Are there any other comments? I'll just make one comment, which is that I think that the submissions that we heard were quite overwhelming, and they weren't just from the sort of Banks Peninsula side of the hill. They certainly were reflected on the Sumner side as well. And I think that the real issue here, and I would like to kind of be able to record this when we get in front of the Local Government Commission, is that there isn't a provision really in legislation that allows specifically for the merger of a small council that's rural with a large urban council. And the challenge of finding the right link point between them just really proved too difficult without putting this up as a proposal. So I support the proposal. I hope that the Local Government Commission will give us a little bit more time to think about how we provide for better integration across our city's boundaries, which are now beyond the city boundary, as it were, into the Banks Peninsula area. Yeah, so I think that a little bit more work needs to be done nationally, I think, in terms of these integration issues, because they will come up again. There will be other mergers that occur around the country, and I think it would be useful to have the Local Government Commission look at this very, very specifically. They looked at it last time. They asked us to look at it again, specifically around community of interest, and I think that we've done exactly what the Local Government Commission asked us to do. What we proposed was the only thing we could have proposed, and I think that now that we've given this matter careful consideration, it now will be in the hands of the Local Government Commission. So I'll put the first of the resolutions. Now, I think that there'll be a division on this, so have we got that set up for that? So if we could have the first resolution, those in favour of the first resolution, which is to reject the submissions. If you're in favour of rejecting the submissions that supported the initial proposal to integrate Banks Peninsula into Banks Peninsula Sumner Ward, then vote yes.
So
otherwise, no.
Yes.
Yeah.
That you support keeping it as an isolated community.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yes is for an isolated community.
Okay.
And that is carried. And the second resolution is amending the initial proposal to allow for Banks Peninsula to remain as a single ward. So again, I just turned on the microphone, which I didn't. Instead of voting yes, I turned on the microphone. And that's also carried. Thank you. And the next item for debate are the number of councillors in the city, which received a fair number of submissions and focus of various groups. You'll move that. Who said that? Pauline? Pauline moved that, and the first one, and seconded by Glenn. The next resolution was to amend the initial proposal of 16 councillors and amend the status quo. So the recommendation is to reject the submissions to amend that proposal. Would someone like to move that we reject the amendments to the proposal? Pauline, seconded by Ali. Is there another one? Yeah. And amend the initial proposal of 16 would prefer status quo. Also, someone moved to reject that submission as well. Yanni, seconded by Andrew. All right, I'll open up the debate on the number of councillors. Would anyone like to debate that? Yanni?
Thank you. Oh, sorry, using the wrong system. I just wanted to repeat, I guess, those earlier comments in regards to the peninsula. Now that we've made the decision to accept the submissions from the peninsula, it's my view that the feedback and desire from the city was for local and smaller ward representation than the current status quo. And if you think about the implications of the peninsula being separate, what you effectively do is increase the population ratios in the urban wards. So personally, I actually think we need to consider, and this was discussed following submissions, that we should actually add an additional urban ward to compensate for the peninsula having its separate one. I think that enables us to have more effective and fair representation of those urban communities. And what we heard from people in the central city, for example, around possibly the desire to have a community board. We heard from people in the coastal area that given the magnitude of the earthquake issues, that they would like to be more represented as well. So I think we heard a compelling case, not just from the peninsula, but from other communities in the city to have more local representation. So I totally reject staying with the status quo. I won't speak to that amendment, and that's why I was happy to move it. I think with our population growth, remaining as we currently are is not an option. In fact, interesting enough, when you look at the population ratios, actually they don't actually change that much, even with the addition of the proposed 3 councillors because of our population growth. So it's an interesting position to be in. But a number of people that have been listed as supporting the 16 actually didn't quite specify the 16. What they said is they supported the move towards a higher number of councillors and smaller local wards. So you could take them to be either 4-3 or 4-4, which are the two main issues. So depending on what way you read those submissions. So I think people were pretty open to it, and I think the key thing is that they supported local representation in a smaller ward basis. So I'll vote against the 2 first resolutions in this and support the final one. Thanks.
It's the 16. Yeah. Are there any, Paul?
I'm going to be voting against 16 councillors and going for the status quo. I mean, what I heard from a number of the people that submitted is that they were very happy with the representation this term, and they will be very concerned if there was a change. So on that basis, I'll be voting for 14 councillors, or the 13 councillors as status quo.
Phil, Andrew, Ali.
I'm going to support the staff recommendation that we, the proposal 16, that be our final proposal, for 3 reasons. Basically, when the information we had back from the pre-engagement with a large number of people, up to 3,000, was very clear that people wanted more contact with their local councillor. Also, when there was a relatively small number of submissions, but the large majority of those submissions that came in wanted an increase in the number of councillors, or certainly more than the status quo. And I think also that given the situation that Christchurch is in terms of us, 5 years down from the biggest earthquake this country's ever had, still, and half the city in many ways still recovering, and also us wanting to regenerate the city, it's essential that we have the firing power at the council table. And so I'm certainly supporting the 16.
Andrew?
I'm also happy to support the 16. I think 16 councillors will respond to what we heard through the initial round of public engagement and through the submissions, in as much as it will allow for a better level of local representation. It'll bring democracy closer to the people. It'll allow for more local and smaller wards, possibly a better definition of communities of interest, and more effective and more fair representation. I also note that a number of submitters that supported 16 also stated that they possibly would have liked more than 16 councillors. That's essentially where I'm coming from. I would have liked to have seen more than 16, but given that this is where we've got to, and we've got mapping that supports 16, and that 16 achieves a number of the objectives that have been supported in the engagement and through the submissions, yes, ideally I'd like more than 16. What's in front of me today is a recommendation for 16, and I would urge my colleagues to support the 16 in as much as it delivers those objectives. So I'll be in favour of this today.
Ellie and then David.
Thank you. I think there are many assumptions made in the suggestion that more councillors means better representation. I don't think that's necessarily true. I think that we need better support as councillors in order to be in the wards more, better systems and processes to support the current councillors, and that will enable us to work more effectively and improve that representation. So I do not support the idea that just increasing the number of councillors will increase the level of representation.
David, then Jamie.
Thank you. Look, I'm going to support the status quo. I would have originally supported a move to one more councillor. The feedback that I have in the community is that we are having good representation from our councillors at the moment. And I think given the situation that our city's been in the last 5 years, we have arguably gone through the toughest part of our council with 13 councillors. There will be an added cost to increasing the number of councillors in our city, and I think that it doesn't send a great message to increase the number of councillors, and I'd rather see an increase in the redevelopment of the city rather than spending money on increased numbers of councillors.
Jamie, then Glenn.
Yep, I'll agree with the last speaker there. So I disagree that an increase to 16 councillors is the way to go. A number of the submitters that are listed here, they haven't necessarily said that they love the idea of 16 councillors. It's what they've said is, look, if in a lot of instances I can recognise the names and recall the submissions where they've said, look, if you are going to go down this path, well, we may not necessarily agree with it. Here are some of the smaller aspects that could be refined within this model. So the reality with these hearings is that it's not a first past the post system. It's not the amount of people with a shoulder tap that come along and say what you agree with. You've got to sit down here and use your noggin and digest what the submitters have said, and you weigh that up, and there'll be pros and cons for everything. But it's our job as elected members to weight what is being said by these submitters. And I think what's really clear to me is that whilst the pre-engagement may not always be necessarily scientific, and at times there can be an argument that sometimes consultation isn't always the perfect system and always isn't scientific. And I agree that when you've got 80+% of people saying in the press survey that they don't want more councillors, that also isn't the most scientific way of going about things. I accept that. But the conversations that I've had with people around this are the ones that I find most compelling, are that exactly what Ali said, and that's more isn't necessarily better. Quality over quantity is sometimes a better option. And I think that, in my view, and from the submissions that we've heard, reading between the lines, the thrust of it was that people want effective and efficient councils. And I don't see people banging down the doors at the council chambers to say that they're not well represented. I heard a lot of people say that they feel very adequately represented. And I think following on from that, the most important thing is from time to time, residents will have a local issue which crops up and it rattles them. And when that happens, or if that happens, and for most people it often doesn't, that they have a meaningful way to engage in the local democratic process. And I believe they have that now. So I think we run the risk of being the committee that's charged with creating a horse, and you end up with a camel by making change for change's sake that doesn't necessarily serve that purpose. I hear arguments for local decision making, and I think that is a fair argument, but we're having the wrong conversation with it under a councillor banner, because I think that grassroots local decision making is better placed at the community board level, whereas at the council table we're talking about what's the capital release program going to look like, what are you going to do with the town hall, Where do you put in an LTP, our contribution to a stadium and the like? And that local decision making at a grassroots level, well, I back that and I feel that it's important for residents to be close to it. That's what your community boards are there for. So I think that we run the risk of going down a path of change for change's sake and creating a camel with adding more councillors when we've got information that we're basing this on from 2013 census, of which I know I've moved twice since then, and a number of other people are. We've gone through so much. We're doing district plan review, Regenerate Christchurch, Development Christchurch, Capital Release Program. Goodness, I can't think of all the pressing issues that we've got on our plate right now that no other council throughout the country has got. And I think when you've got a new census being done next year and a new council coming in next year, that would actually be quite a sensible place to do that. And also before then, we need to sort out the delegations for community boards, and that's the place for the local decision making. So the greatest weight that I gave to submissions was the one to say, it isn't really that broken, there's probably a more appropriate time to do it. So I will be rejecting the proposal to increase to 16 councillors because I don't think that better is necessary, bigger is better.
Glenn, then Jimmy.
Thank you. I'm going to support the proposal, and I'm going to come back to answering the question, what is our task, which is to determine fair and effective representation. My view is that through 16, along with the next recommendation over the wards, they're treated separately, but they go together, that we will achieve that. We'll achieve a more effective ratio by having a lower ratio of councillors to wards. We have geographical constituencies identified in these recommendations, but we also have social constituencies within and across these geographic boundaries. This will enable our lower socio-economic areas, in my view, to have greater representation, which is what tends to happen when you have smaller areas. They have a greater chance of being represented. So I see it, this is to be treated separately from the next recommendation, but in fact both do go together in terms of answering that question of creating a fairer and a more effective representation.
Jimmy?
Okay, thank you. Yeah. I think the consultation is a political evidence. That's very, very important. If we review all those submissions, we can see the 8 committee board members fully support, the number of councillors increase from current 13 to the 16 members. And also quite a few resident associations also fully support this recommendation. Also, if we review the current, even the demographic or the population increase, etc., moment is a lot of the kind of the workers, people, the infrastructure to the Christchurch, and also the trend will continue growth. It's roughly a moment, probably a year, at least 3,000 people, net growth, the population will in the Christchurch for the kind of reconstruction or regeneration, etc. And also the staff have a kind of a long process of the pre-consultation and establish this draft, the proposal, to kind of 16 councillors. And also we consider the fair representation, effective representation, and community of interest, etc. are all, is kind of the 16 councillors bolster the kind of the based the resolution. So I support the draft proposal, the future councillors, the 16 councillors. Thank you.
Pauline?
Thank you. I think that the system is actually broken at the moment because of the huge population changes we've seen in Christchurch. So we do have to do this right now. And it doesn't stop us from looking at it again in 3 years. And in actual fact, we're obliged to do it every 6 years. So, and at the risk of thinking that the city's only the size of Arana Park, we've got more things to do than create camels. And yes, councillors do need to be up at a strategic level and have a helicopter view, But we also need to be really in touch with our communities, and it's what people want. So to have more councillors is obviously going to enable that. So that's why I'm supporting that. And also the reduction of the geographical area will help people to know their councillor and vice versa. So it would also bring us closer to the national average of representation, of which Christchurch right now is way out of kilter. We're sitting around 1 in 28,000 people per councillor. This will bring us down to around about 22,000, 23,000, I think, and it's still, I think, higher than the national average. So I will be supporting an increased number of councillors for those reasons.
Thank you. Look, I just do want to respond to one of the submissions that we received, which was, you know, very much to keep what we had and not have to go through this process now because of all of the reasons that have been outlined in the debate. We don't have that as an option. Legally, we don't. The Local Government Act, as Pauline Cotter's just highlighted, the Local Electoral Act says that we have to undergo this process every 6 years. So we haven't undergone this process, so we have to undergo it. The last time, 2009, the Local Government Commission gave us a very clear steer around Banks Peninsula. So that's really been the driver of the proposal. Now that we've looked at the proposal again and given careful consideration to all the submissions that we received and made the decision around Banks Peninsula, at the end of the day, the 16 councillors, for me, works the best. And I just remind people that back in 2003, that's exactly the number that was highlighted or that arrived at when that proposal went forward. And the reason that the Local Government Commission did what it did at that time was that the council was completely divided about the nature of the changes that were introduced, because they were significantly different wards. And it actually looked a lot easier just to jam two of them together than it was to completely redo it. And I think what we've done this time is we've got to 16 councillors, and we haven't just redone them completely. They've got enough linkages to the previous wards for people to see that they belong in the right ward for the council position. So I really do think that we've got to a good place on this. But what I'm going to do is to reverse the order of the decision making, just so that we get to the initial proposal at the conclusion. Because if one of the other options succeeds, or that we don't, or we got an even number, then we would revert to the initial proposal if we couldn't get a decision otherwise. So I'm not putting that very well, but we'll start with the resolution to amend the initial proposal of 16 councillors to the status quo, which is 13 councillors. And that has been moved and seconded. So I will, oh no, actually it's been moved and seconded that we reject this. So for people who support the current number of councillors over any of the other suggestions, then you need to vote against this. So no, it's counterintuitive because of the recommendations being to reject. So if you support 13 councillors, then as opposed to the 16 that have been recommended, then you must vote no. And for those of us who want to reject the submission, then we vote yes. Right? So if you support the 16, vote yes. So that is carried, and so that submission is rejected, and we move to the initial proposal. So we're proposing to reject the submission, except I think Councillor Johansson may have misunderstood what you were voting for. This is rejecting the submissions to amend the proposal for more councillors. Oh, no, that was... No, that's the correct one, yeah.
I'm going to vote against like the previous lot did.
Yeah.
Yep.
Sorry, which one am I doing?
So I think that's right. So you need to this one here. So go down.
Sorry, it's this one here. Sorry, because I had it in front of me. Can we lift it up? This is to reject the proposal. Yeah, that's right. So for those that want more than 16 councillors to be the final proposal, then yeah, to more than 16 councillors. That's correct. That's why I was getting confused. Then, so again, for those that believe that we should have more than 16 councillors, that should be our final proposal, then you would vote no. If you support 16 councillors, then vote yes. Yes? Eh?
You're voting to reject the submission, so...
This is voting to reject the submission.
You don't want more than 16.
You don't want more than 16.
So you vote yes.
So vote yes. Yep. So this is to reject the submission. The recommendation is to reject the submission. The submission proposed that there be more than 16 councillors. So it is no. I was just making it easy for people who are happy with 16. If you are happy with 16 or don't want more, then vote yes.
If you don't want to increase the number of councillors, then vote no. It doesn't mean that you support the 16, you'll get a chance to vote.
Yeah, although we are going to have to... look, actually, can we change the resolution so it says reject the submission to amend the proposal to... no, more than 16 councillors, and then we need to have another recommendation because... Yeah, okay. Well, let's go up and let's vote on the 16. Can we vote on the 16 first? Because if that is carried, which I'm assuming it will be, then we can actually work out the detailed resolutions that we need to flow on from that. So those who are in favour of retaining the initial proposal of 16 councillors becomes the council's final proposal, vote yes. Or if you are opposed to that, vote no. This is just straight the 16. What we're saying...
It's the same if you reduce it, but you should, if you're going to amend it, amend the increase.
What Leanne was asking is, it says...
I'm just saying, agree to retain the initial proposal, that the initial proposal of 16 councillors become the council's final proposal. So that's carried. So that becomes the final proposal. Are there particular recommendations that...
Sorry, can I just check what happened to that second amendment?
We're going to put the second amendment now.
It's effectively the same thing.
No, it's actually the same thing. If you support the proposal, you're rejecting more or less.
But I think you want to show... Yeah, I want to show that I supported that. So because you've done it around the other way, now my voting record doesn't actually make any sense,
Yeah.
but that's okay.
So reject the submission to amend the proposal to more than 16 councillors. So if we could put that resolution, so people who wanted to show their support for more than 16 councillors, can you vote? Well, it's no, isn't it?
It's no, because
if you vote no, then you are supporting more than 16 councillors, right?
Yeah.
This is about rejecting the submission. Sorry, look, I did say at the beginning that these are technical, detailed resolutions that we have to carry or lose. So this simply says reject the submission to amend the proposal to more than 16 councillors. If you want more than 16 councillors,
yeah, it's all right, it's carried.
It's carried, right.
So if you want less than 16.
Yeah. Okay, and now we've got, because some of the submissions actually suggested we amend the proposal for fewer, not less, get that grammatically correct, fewer than 16 councillors, we're just, this is the grammar police here, so would someone move that we reject the submission to amend the proposal for fewer than 16 councillors? Well, it's actually fewer than 14, isn't it?
No, we've done the status quo. It's the proposal, so it's fewer than the proposal.
Oh,
fewer than the status quo.
Right, amend the proposal for fewer. It's fewer than the proposal. That's right. So that's moved by Phil, seconded by Pauline. Eh? That's right. Fewer councillors. If you want fewer, vote no. If you want less, go and do some grammar training.
If you want great, yeah.
Yeah. Right, that's carried. So that's all sorted. Right, so now we move on to number of councillors per ward. So this is the issue about election at large across community board areas, election by ward. And the first motion is that the initial proposal of single member wards be confirmed as the council's final proposal. Pauline will move that, seconded by Andrew. The next one is that, oh yes, that we agree that the initial proposal of 16 councillors elected from each single ward be confirmed as the council's final proposal. So basically this one is basically saying that councillors will be elected from wards as opposed to being elected at large. So we won't have 16 elected at large but from individual wards. So who would move that? Tim will move that, seconded by Glenn. And the next one is what is the submission saying?
This is supporting at large. This is the 13.
Oh, this is supporting election at large. Well, how?
And then there's one about multi-member wards.
But why have we got two separate resolutions when they're the opposite? Councillors should be elected by ward constituency, not at large. It's really support election at large. That's one. You're either for or against.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, but we have to respond to each group of solutions.
Okay. All right. So and then. So will someone move that we don't support election at large, which is the opposite of what we just.
Same two.
Yeah, Phil and David.
Can I just be clear on what election at large means there? Because
it means just across the whole thing, the whole
as in
city.
Councillors are elected like the mayor.
Yeah.
Yes.
Not as joined up subdivisions to make
the next one is multi-member wards. So would someone like to move that we reject multi-member wards? Because that will be, I know that's going to be a debating issue because some people prefer multi-member wards. So, Tim, and seconded by Pauline.
So we want to group these debates separately we should have the two at-large or not at-large together and then the two single-member wards with multi-member wards.
Yeah, but there's really just, we'll just have a single debate because the issues for debate are whether we, I mean, I just think that the issue that members will want to debate, because having discussed these issues, it's clear that some members believe that there should be the joining of wards to make multi-member or two-member wards. So that would be something that could be dealt with in the multi-member ward component of this. I think we were quite clear, unless somebody wants to. Anyway, but you can debate the issue of whether election is at large across community board areas or election by single ward. So I'll just open that up for debate. No debate?
Oh, yeah.
Jamie?
Yeah, sorry, I'm just getting my head around this exactly. Just with the double negatives and everything through it, you just need to take a pause for a moment. I think I get what we're saying here.
We're responding to each of the submissions, so that's why they're couched as whether we reject them or accept them.
Of the three things there, there's three things touched on really. Election of councillors across the board, at large, just like the mayor, single member wards or one councillor per subdivision, or the third one being really those subdivisions which are joined up as proposed would elect their councillors across those wards. So the first one, at large, no, I don't think that's workable. You can't, this is representation, effective, efficient, fair representation, all that sort of stuff. I think that you'd, there's some sense in it, and if you wanted to be a board of governors or a board of directors, then you'd elect 6 councillors at large, and they could just get on with it. Probably really effective, really efficient, not great representation. That's exactly what I said. No. So that wouldn't work. So no, I'm not going to support that. But then on the flip side, I think then electing one councillor per subdivision, don't support either. So that's why actually, like in the middle, I found the most compelling submissions were the ones in the middle that said the joined up subdivisions that are being proposed have the councillors elected throughout those subdivisions or throughout that ward as a whole, which is effectively the status quo. So I'll speak to that really now. Why I like that is that there is a different oath that you take as a community board member and as a councillor, and as a councillor you need to be really looking with a city-centric view, that if there's perhaps a proposal for something that's going to benefit your ward, you need to be making sure that you're taking that Christchurch Inc. approach and saying, yep, I know I'm elected sort of by this area, but for the greater good of Christchurch, this is probably a good way to go. There was an interesting submission, which I hadn't thought of this prior to us going into the hearings process, but I think the guy actually had a PhD, and he was saying that what he thought would happen is that if you had a councillor that was elected per subdivision, one member and one member alone, that even if you do join up, like is being proposed, those 2 or 3 subdivisions to form a ward, they're not accountable in a true sense to those other areas, and that effectively you get this petty parochialism for that area where they will inherently try to support that small patch within that ward because the other ones don't elect them. They're not on their voting paper, and I think that ultimately, when people want to contact their elected representative, they want to contact someone that was on their voting paper, and to have multi-members per that ward I think makes sense. You can share the load a bit, and you can also differentiate the difference between a community board member and a city councillor, and I think that it gives you the ability to really say at a community board meeting with the 2 or 3 joined up subdivision community boards, the councillors to take that holistic view and to try and bring that city council perspective there to say, hang on, but take a big picture view with this, and they are elected by that greater area on the ballot papers anyway. So I think it's a good compromise. At large across the city just doesn't work. Sure, it gives that big city perspective, but I think it does lose that representation at a local level. And I think but on the flip side, I think that electing that councillor from the subdivision and subdivision alone means you have one councillor that is effectively there as a super community board member, falling into the trap of really banging on for their little subdivision at a council level, and I think that is a recipe for disaster. And it was alluded to a number of times throughout the submissions process, and I think it makes a lot of sense. The Local Government Commission generally errs against that, and I think they err against it for good reason. And that having that distinction between a community board member and a councillor is actually good governance, that you can have those councillors there that look after that ward, which gives that local input, that local representation, but also gives the benefit of having that holistic view to join the subdivision community board members to take that ward approach. So I think it's the best of both worlds, and it means that if someone's away, then the person that can pick up the slack is just as accountable as the next person. So I think that makes a lot of sense, and I think there were some really good submissions along those lines, and hence why I'll be supporting, well, double negative, I'll be rejecting the proposed rejection, if that makes any sense.
Right, Ali and then Yanni.
Thank you. I'd just like to endorse a lot of what Jamie said. I don't support the at-large across the city. I think councillors need to know their immediate neighbourhoods. I certainly don't support the single member wards, and for the reasons that Jamie has also mentioned, there are many problems, and in some wards there's a real concentration of those problems. In Shirley Papanui particularly, you've got issues around transport that are different to problems in other parts of the city. You've got the street workers issue, you've got the flooding issue. There are problems and issues in the ward that are very specific to Shirley Papanui, and having two members, elected members, working on them means that it's a problem that's shared. We have different experience, we have different political takes on things as well, and it's the ability to be able to bounce those ideas off someone that is at the same level of responsibility and accountability as Jamie said, that is really, really important. And if you want to be mundane about it, yes, if one of us falls over, there is someone else there. If you do need to go on holiday and you've got someone else there. So I strongly support retaining the double member wards and won't support the single member wards for the reasons that both Jamie and I have just mentioned.
Yanni?
Thank you. I support the idea of having local wards and single member wards. I think actually that I was on a community board when you had the two different wards that joined together, and actually I thought it worked okay. It seemed to work quite well actually. So you didn't seem to get the parochialism. So you had two councillors from each ward joining together, but it wasn't engaged with a whole bunch of parochial infighting. Actually, most people, when they were on the community board, came together and worked through the issues relevant to that ward. So my experience has been positive. So I think you can combine two different wards to form a community board without the issues that have been raised. I like the idea of local wards because I think it actually increases local accountability. And I think it's really interesting. I remember when I went and did the skateboarding submission many years ago, I drove around to where every councillor lived, and it's really interesting to think about where councillors live in relation to a city being represented. And I think it's really important to have local diversity amongst councillors on this council representing the entire city. And the issue, if you combine the wards that we have, is you get areas with high voter turnout next to areas of low voter turnout. And in many ways, the same arguments that the people on the peninsula put for not joining in with the urban ward, they didn't want the people in Sumner determining who their representative was, I think applies to the issue of what happens in the urban area. In that, you know, take the Hagley-Ferrymead ward at the moment. Ferrymead's got 65% voter turnout. The Hagley side has got 35% voter turnout. So it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out where the votes in that ward, how they actually determine who represents them. So I think it's really important that we do go back to a system of smaller wards, and I support single member wards. I also think it increases the accountability of that councillor to be involved and to attend. I think it means that they have a much more local connection to the local community than they otherwise may get with having two. So very supportive of going to this issue. To this system.
Andrew?
Thank you. I don't support councillors being elected at large across the city, and I equally don't support any option of multi-member wards. So I do support the single-member wards for similar reasons to the fact that I support an increase in the number of councillors. This will result in bringing democracy closer to the people, and it also speaks to the accountability of those councillors as a single member representing that ward. It allows for communities to have a councillor closer to them, and for that councillor to be closer to the community rather than a more distant relationship conducted over a wider area. Single-member wards also allow for a wider range of people to stand for election and to allow a wider range of people standing a better chance of being elected, not least because it makes the election campaign cover a smaller area and therefore makes it more affordable and therefore more accessible to more people. Now, I'm in a unique position at the moment as being the only single ward councillor around this council table, and I've got to say that that has been a positive experience. I don't believe that a local focus and a citywide view are actually mutually exclusive. I think it's quite possible to balance both of those. A well-connected councillor can be an excellent local advocate at the same time as being a very effective city governor. And I believe a single councillor being elected for a smaller ward allows for the councillor to be more across those local issues and to be a better advocate for them here at the council table, in addition to the work that the community board are quite rightfully doing in that space. Advocacy at the council table based on a good understanding of a local community and its needs can surely only be a good thing when this is also carried out with an effective metropolitan approach, and I believe that this can be done. I certainly don't believe that the two are in any way mutually exclusive.
Phil?
I also strongly oppose the concept of voting at large for a councillor, and certainly believe that single-member wards at a local level give the best representation. I think once you combine wards, and even like we currently have, some of the combined wards are populations of over 60,000 people. Surely that's the beginning of voting at large, or it has been. And 60,000 people is greater than the whole population of Invercargill. And we've been talking about 2 councillors representing such a large area. And the argument that in fact councillors will be parochial, I don't buy. I believe that in fact part of the job of governance at the council table is that we make decisions in the interests of the whole city, and I would expect that councillors would continue to do that. The pre-engagement certainly showed that people wanted to have more contact with their local councillor. That means that in fact a smaller local area or single wards is really what people expected. And I think it's been raised that in fact the size of the ward isn't just like a population or geographic construct. There are many wards where we have special separate ethnic communities. The whole, and it's been referred to in the discussion about the concept of much of our city and the wards having a socio-economic basis, that they're quite distinct communities, and in fact everybody has to be represented. So this gives, having single-member wards gives this council the opportunity of having the best representation.
David?
Thank you. Like everyone else, I think representation at large is not something that I would favour. I'm certainly in favour of the multi-member ward. We've heard speakers today talking about democracy being closer to the people, localised issues. Then we have a community board that invariably covers at least a couple of wards, and I think it's quite beneficial to have 2 councillors to be able to cover that joint area. There will be localised issues. Ali's raised issues like the Flockton Basin, which may, in a restructure, just fall in the responsibility of one councillor. And I believe it's far more advantageous to spread that load. We talked, other speakers have talked about 2 councillors covering 60-odd thousand. We are now looking at 1 councillor covering somewhere between 20 and 25,000. I don't see that we're getting any huge advantage by a small reduction in representation there, and I firmly believe that with those paired wards and the community board working as a function of two wards, that we get a better ability for issues to be covered by two councillors than you would do with one.
Glenn?
Thank you. If you look at the maps for the proposed wards and consider what the scenario would be if we had election at large, there's no guarantee that some of those areas, this actually picks up on a point that Vicky's made before, there's no guarantee that some of those areas would actually be represented around this council table. Along with single member wards, we enhance and we make greater equitability of representation in the city, in my view, also with multi-member wards. In multi-member wards, there is still the chance that smaller voices will be drowned out by larger. And so I do support this promotion of the single member wards so to enhance the voices of all in our community.
Paul?
I agree, voting at large would be a massive mistake. However, I do actually believe that multi-representation in a ward is actually important. It gives a chance for diversity. You know, it would be easy for one councillor to take a particular stand and drive a board in a particular direction, but two councillors in a particular ward could certainly balance it out. The other part too is obviously if there is an issue with one councillor or something happens and he's gone on holiday, there's that balance here as well. So I think it's important. So, you know, as I say, I'll be supporting the two councillor per ward or multi-councillor per ward.
Raf?
Yeah, there's been some very good and persuasive arguments on both sides here, but I think the thing for me is around the community representation, and I think one of the issues we've tried to push as a council here has been more delegations to community boards. I don't think we've achieved that yet in this term. And what worries me about shifting in a way down the hierarchy of representation, bringing councillors down to that single ward level, is actually that you will marginalise the community board representation aspect, and that's what we're trying to actually improve. I think the submission that I found the most persuasive was Shuris's one, where he actually took the representation at the national level with an MP representing a large ward, two councillors, and then say 4 community board members for the individual wards. And I think that's what we should be looking at. So, I mean, I can accept the arguments on both sides here, but I do worry that if we have one councillor in the little ward, it will actually be doing the job that the community board is supposed to be doing. And I think that's what we're trying to improve upon, and that's kind of the community level representation that we're trying to improve, and actually give them more work to do. And actually a lot of community board members complain to me they don't have enough to do, they don't have enough responsibility. So I think, you know, shifting to whatever 16 wards, great, that's fine, with community board members being elected from that ward. Then I think as you go up the hierarchy, the councillors then get elected from the next level up, which is a wider geographic area, so that they can actually work across that whole area and then take that up to council level. So that's why I would support the election at large within a community board area.
Look, I mean, I think that's a really good debate. So, and I knew that it would be the one that would, you know, spark off, you know, the consideration of the issues, because and it's been done really well. Just to comment on the electoral wards for the electoral boundaries for the parliamentary seats. The trouble is that they go into the Waimakariri District Council and into the Selwyn District Council, so we don't get a perfect match. But it is something that is worth considering, I think, for the future. But I wanted to put on the record my concern that with our, you know, desire to achieve, you know, the kind of mix around the council table that would give you a good decision-making framework in terms of dealing with complex problems. Complexity requires people with different views, different backgrounds, different points of view to be able to come to the table and to really thrash out issues. You don't get that on a geographic basis. And that's, to me, the real shortfall in the legislative framework, and that's why I'd like to put it on the record, because at some stage I really think that we should think about whether we want to have young people specifically represented at the table and not having to win a award on a geographic basis to do so. Whether, you know, we want someone from, you know, particular interest groups or identity groups sitting around the table to help us resolve issues that are extremely challenging. So I just think that there probably are other ways of identifying communities of interest other than geographic ones. And geographic communities of interest are, you know, particularly, you know, we're particularly aware of them because of what we've been through. But communities of identity and communities of interest go well beyond geographic boundaries. So that's something that I would like the Local Government Commission to be recommending to government next time it reviews the Local Electoral Act. Anyway, so let's have probably the easiest way to do this is to have a resolution that makes it clear whether the preference is to join the wards together, so that we have that the initial, yeah, but then there's only two options really. That's the single wards or the joining together. And I think the joining together we should vote on first, because let's see what the view of the council is.
Do we have to reject voting at large as well?
Yeah, we will do that, but that's not the big issue. I mean, I think people are generally quite happy with voting at large. You know, I mean, I could put that resolution first, which I don't know that there is actually a specific resolution. No, that we deal with that at the end, don't we?
Well, we could. I mean, it is covered by that one.
Okay, so we could put the. We'll put the. Can you go to the draft resolutions, the ones that the big ones that we do at the end?
Can I just ask an annoying question? If we're voting to join them together, given that Rickerton Woodrum becomes 3, are we joining 3 together for that ward?
No, look, let's just deal with this first, and then I'll come to that.
I don't think we should assume that 2-member wards necessarily endorses the joining together of the wards as they've been presented to us. I think there's a differentiation between those two things. So those of us who support 2-member wards may not necessarily support basically bunging what we've been presented with together.
All right. Well, we'll just put the initial proposal then. We'll put that first. Okay, so the first resolution, and I need a mover and a seconder for this, and I'll move this so that for the sake of having it dealt with, that after considering submissions, Council confirms its initial proposal that for the 2016 local authority elections, the Christchurch City Council members other than the Mayor are to be elected by the electors of wards rather than by the electors of the district as a whole. That's a technical resolution and seconded by Tim. So
So you mean it's a bigger area or small area?
Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter.
Oh, by ward. Okay.
Yeah. So I will just put that motion. All those in favour say aye. Those opposed say no. That's carried unanimously. So that's fine. So I'll now put that the initial proposal of single-member wards be confirmed as the council's final proposal. So I'll put that. That's been moved and seconded. So can you put the So this is the initial proposal that we've gone out with, that we confirm it as the final proposal, that they be single-member wards. Okay. So that's been carried. So the rest of the resolutions.
So that's clear that we've rejected multi-member. That's all right.
Yeah.
Yep.
So do we need to put those other?
No.
We don't need to put the other ones?
No.
Okay. So in that case, we'll take a break for lunch and reconvene at 12:45. Or are we bringing the food back in? It's just out the back. Yeah. Yeah. Well, till 12:45. Yeah, just under 30 minutes.